What if one of the smartest men in America helped lead the nation into one of the greatest disasters? What if the very skills that made him successful in business, government, and war also blinded him to reality? And perhaps most importantly, what if numbers could tell you almost everything except what truly matters? Today's story is not simply about Vietnam. It's not simply about the Cold War. It's about one man who believed every problem could be solved through logic, data, and analysis. A man who transformed the Pentagon, helped prevent nuclear war, and then found himself trapped inside a conflict that refused to obey the rules of mathematics. His name was Robert McNamara, and his story forces us to ask a difficult question. Can war ever truly be managed like a business, or are some human problems too complex to fit inside a spreadsheet? Today on the JQA Treatment, we explore Robert McNamara's life before office, his tenure as Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, and his legacy, both his triumphs and his failures. Robert Strange McNamara was born in San Francisco in 1916. From an early age, numbers made sense to him. Patterns made sense. Systems made sense. Unlike many future politicians who dreamed of speeches and elections, McNamara excelled at something less glamorous: analysis. He attended UC Berkeley during the depths of the Great Depression. Imagine being a young student during a time when banks were collapsing, businesses were failing, and millions of Americans were unemployed. I'd say it'd be actually nice to be in college because you didn't have to worry about trying to find a job. For McNamara, the lesson was clear. Bad decisions had consequences. Good decisions required facts, evidence, data, and logic. And these ideas followed him to Harvard Business School. There he became part of a new generation of thinkers who believed that modern organizations could be improved through scientific management. To them, inefficiency wasn't inevitable. It was a problem waiting to be solved. But then came World War II. And suddenly, those theories faced their ultimate test. Now, most people associate McNamara with Vietnam, but the first war that shaped him was World War II. And this chapter of his life is actually often overlooked. During the war, McNamara joined the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Division. The name sounds boring. The work was anything but. American bombers were flying dangerous missions across Europe and the Pacific. Every mission generated enormous amounts of information: aircraft losses, bombing accuracy, fuel consumption, casualty rates, mission success. McNamara's job was to make sense of the chaos, to find patterns, to improve efficiency, and to save lives through better planning. Working under General Curtis LeMay, McNamara helped analyze bombing campaigns against Japan. And here we encounter one of the great moral questions of his career: the firebombing of Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Tokyo alone suffered devastation on a scale almost unimaginable. And years later, McNamara reflected on those events and remembered LeMay saying something striking. If America had lost the war, they might have been prosecuted as war criminals. But think about that. The difference between hero and criminal sometimes depends on who wins. And that realization haunted McNamara. But it also reinforced his belief that decisions had to be based on careful analysis. Data could prevent mistakes. Data could improve outcomes, and data could make war more efficient. It was a lesson he carried into every future position, including the most important one of his life. So after the war, McNamara joined Ford Motor Company. And at the time, Ford was struggling. Management systems were outdated, financial controls were weak, and decision-making often relied on instinct rather than evidence. Now, McNamara hated it. Along with a group of former military analysts known as the Whiz Kids, he introduced statistical analysis, cost controls, forecasting models, and performance metrics. All the cool things. The results were dramatic. Ford became more efficient, more profitable, more competitive, and McNamara's rise was meteoric. By 1960, he became the first president of Ford Motor Company who wasn't a member of the Ford family. It was a pretty cool achievement, and it attracted the attention of a newly elected young president, JFK. Now, Kennedy saw something in McNamara that represented the future. He was young, brilliant, analytical, and modern. Exactly the type of leader a young Kennedy wanted in Washington. So in January of 1961, after only a few weeks as Ford's president, I think it was only like 5 weeks, McNamara received a phone call that changed his life. Kennedy wanted him to run the Pentagon. Now, McNamara accepted, and neither man could have imagined where that decision could lead. When McNamara entered the Pentagon, the Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons, obviously, and Berlin remained divided. Communism appeared to be spreading, and the stakes could not have been higher. Yet McNamara approached defense the same way he had approached Ford. He looked for inefficiencies. He looked for waste. He looked for redundancies, poor management. He found plenty of it. Military branches often competed for resources. Weapons programs lacked oversight. Budgets ballooned. McNamara brought order. He introduced systems analysis, performance metrics, long-term planning, cost-benefit evaluations. To supporters, he was revolutionizing national defense. And to critics, he was turning war into accounting. Yet one of the greatest moments came not in Vietnam, but in Cuba. In October 1962, American spy planes photographed Soviet nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. And suddenly the Cold War became terrifyingly real, because the missiles sat only 90 miles from Florida. Minutes away from American cities, for 13 days the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. And inside the White House, advisors debated options. Some demanded immediate airstrikes, others advocated invasion. And many believed military action was unavoidable. McNamara disagreed. He urged caution, analysis, deliberation. He carefully evaluated risks and consequences. Now, what would happen if America attacked? How would the Soviets respond? What if retaliation triggered a broader conflict? And what if escalation became unstoppable? McNamara supported a naval quarantine instead, a blockade designed to pressure the Soviets without immediately resorting to war. The strategy worked. After tense negotiations, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles, and the crisis ended. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, and many historians consider that McNamara's finest hour. Now, his analytical approach had helped prevent nuclear catastrophe, but success can be dangerous because it reinforces that confidence. And McNamara's confidence in systems, data, and analysis had never been higher. Unfortunately, another crisis was already growing, one that numbers alone could not solve, and that was Vietnam. Because Vietnam was different. Unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was no clear endpoint. There was no single decision and no obvious solution. Instead, there was only ambiguity. There was complexity, there was politics, there was culture that we knew nothing about, there was history there. Because Vietnam was the only war so far that we talk about that is considered escalation, where we are continually putting people and troops there from the 1950s into the 60s and 70s. And so McNamara struggled to understand all of it. Like many American officials, he viewed Vietnam through the lens of the Cold War. If South Vietnam fell to communism, would neighboring countries fall as well? The so-called domino theory suggested they would. So to McNamara, this seemed logical. The data appeared convincing. Containment demanded action. And then came the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. Reports suggested that North Vietnamese forces had attacked American naval vessels, so President Johnson sought congressional authority to respond. McNamara strongly supported escalation, more bombing, more troops, more pressure, because the assumption was straightforward. Apply enough force, inflict enough losses, eventually the enemy will break. But Vietnam wasn't a factory. It was not a balance sheet. And it wasn't a business problem. McNamara increasingly measured progress through statistics. He was looking at enemy casualties. He was looking at body counts, bomb tonnage, territory secured, troop deployments. Each metric suggested progress, yet reality was telling a different story because American troop levels climbed. It went from 50,000, 100,000, 300,000, 500,000. Still, the war continued, and still, victory remained elusive. So the deeper America became involved, the more troubling the evidence grew, and eventually, McNamara began questioning his own assumptions. By 1966 and 1967, something remarkable was happening. The architect of escalation began doubting the war. Privately, McNamara started questioning whether victory was even possible. Reports from the field conflicted with optimistic statistics. Military gains failed to produce political stability. Enemy forces absorbed punishment and continued fighting. The numbers no longer made sense, yet public policy continued moving forward. And this may be the most controversial aspect of McNamara's legacy. Critics argue that he recognized the war's failures but lacked the courage to publicly challenge them. Supporters counter that he has struggled within a political system larger than any single individual. Either way, the contradiction remains. The man who trusted data above all else found himself trapped by policies built upon faulty assumptions. And so in 1968, McNamara resigned as Secretary of Defense. Officially, he moved on to a new opportunity. Unofficially, Vietnam had broken his faith in many of the ideas that had guided his career. After leaving the Pentagon, McNamara became president of the World Bank. For 13 years, he focused on poverty, reduction, economic development, and improving living conditions across the developing world. It was almost as if he spent the next chapter of his life trying to build rather than destroy. Yet Vietnam never disappeared. The war followed him, the questions followed him, the criticisms followed him. And then in 1995, nearly 3 decades after leaving office, McNamara published In Retrospect. The book stunned many readers. Within its pages, he admitted what critics had argued for years, that America had been wrong, the assumptions were flawed, the strategy failed, the understanding of Vietnam was deeply inadequate. For some veterans and families, the admission brought validation, and for others, it felt infuriatingly late. And thousands had died, millions of Vietnamese had died. Could an apology decades later even have been enough? And that question remained unanswered. He tried to atone years later, but to no avail. So, how should we remember Robert McNamara? As a brilliant reformer, a Cold War strategist, a tragic figure, perhaps all three? I mean, his achievements were extraordinary. I think his story in itself is a Netflix series on its own. You know, I mean, he modernized the Pentagon. He helped manage the Cuban Missile Crisis. He improved global development efforts through the World Bank as his atonement. Yet his failures were equally significant. You know, Vietnam exposed the limits of data-driven decision-making. Numbers could measure casualties, but not determination. They could count bombs, but not political legitimacy. They could track territory, but not the will of the people fighting for their own vision of the future. So in the end, McNamara's life became a cautionary tale, not about intelligence, but about its limits. Because some of history's most important questions can't be solved by mathematics alone. And perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of Robert McNamara, you know? The man who tried to measure everything eventually discovered that the most important parts of human experience cannot always be measured at all. It's kind of interesting, right? So next time on the JQA treatment, we turn to Henry Morgenthau Jr., the man who financed World War II, reshaped the economy, and devised one of the most radical post-war plans in history. How did he fund America's war effort? And why was his post-war vision for Germany too extreme for even the Allies to accept? We examine his influence next time. Subscribe now and leave a review. Until next time, please stay curious and keep questioning history.